Hi everybody, this is Laura, City Scrapper. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a Shimmerz layout to share with you. My idea for this layout was to use one of the pattern papers from the Shimmerz color kits for September, then have some mixed media behind it. So I started off with a piece of smooth white cardstock. I've already applied some white gesso to it. And now I'm using the packaging technique to apply some Shimmerz paint in the color Marigold. I love this color. I add a little bit of water to the packaging to help the color move around a little bit. And then I add a little bit more once I have the paint on the background. Then I use my heat tool to dry the paint. In the meantime, though, I'm continuing to add a little bit more water to one of the areas just because I thought it looked a little bit darker. And then I continue to dry with my heat tool. I'm adding another layer of the marigold. I often like to add multiple layers of whatever mixed media I'm putting in the background. I always think that building up the layers of color makes the background have more variation, and then it looks a little more interesting to me. I also wanted to add another color that was similar, so I picked a yellow. This is a Shimmerz paint called Color Splash in Squeeze the Day. And I do the same thing. I add some paint to the plastic, water it down a little bit, and then spread it around the background. Whenever I know I'm going to add a pattern paper on top of a mixed media background, I like to frequently try that pattern paper over the mixed media just to make sure that the colors are working together and also that the placement of the color in the background looks good. Now I'm adding some splatters to the background. I don't want the splatters to be super large in this particular layout, so I use a small brush to spread the splatters out. And then I add a little bit more of the Squeeze the Day to the background, and then use my heat tool to dry it, and then add yet another layer of the yellow to the background. And then I wanted to add some more splatters to the background, and so I once again water down some of the marigold and I splatter that all around the background. I'm laughing watching this video because the background kind of looks like a big mess. There's just a lot of paint all over, but once I put the elements in place, hopefully it will look a little bit better. I'm using a stencil from Dress My Craft. I finally found this stencil, but years ago, I saw someone using it in a process video, and I just had to have this stencil, and it took me quite a while to find it. It's really great because it's a grid background, but it also has some splatters in it, and I don't know if it's still available. I got it a long time ago, but I'll put the information in the description box. If you're interested, who knows, you might be able to find it. I found some really old things on the internet at times. I add some modeling paste through the stencil. I add it to the left and then again to the right side of the layout, and I'm mainly putting the stencil work over the areas where I have the color already applied. I decided on the spot that I wanted to use this little scraping tool and scrape some modeling paste across the layout. I thought it would just add more of a random element to the background, and I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I put some modeling paste on this scraper tool and kind of dragged it across the surface of the layout. Now I'm adding some stamping to the background. I'm using a script stamp that I use on most of my layouts. I bought it at, I think, a flea market or a yard sale years ago. I think it's perfect for so many layouts, so it's one of my go-to background stamps. And I'm using it with some Staz On Ink. The color of the ink that I'm using is Timber Brown. I usually use black for background stamping, but for this layout, I didn't think that there was going to be any other black on the layout, so I thought I would keep it just a little bit more subtle with the brown. Now I'm using a dot stamp, again with the Staz On Ink, and I am stamping some dots on the background too. When I first started adding stamping to my backgrounds, I wasn't sure where to put it. I find that if I just keep the stamping to where I have the areas of color in the background, it looks pretty good. If I stray away from that, sometimes the results are good, sometimes they're bad, but if you're just starting out, that could be something that you might want to try. Add some color to the background, and then if you want to add some stamping, keep the stamping on the areas where you added the color. As I was working on the background, I was thinking that the color would look better if it was extended all the way up to the upper right-hand corner of the layout. So I added a little bit more of the marigold paint to that area. Using the exact same method, I put a little on plastic, I watered it down, and then I smushed it against the page. And then I added some more stamping. I'm using a little grid stamp. It's another one of my go-to stamps. I believe this is from one of those Tim Holtz sets where there are multiple stamps and a stencil that all come in one kit. I once again tried that pattern paper on the background just to make sure that I liked how everything was looking together. Then I did yet more stamping with that little grid stamp. And then it's not super noticeable, but I also added some stamping using a dot stamp. This is another Tim Holtz stamp, and it also came in a pack with a number of stamps and a stencil as well. I remember that the stamps on that particular set were mushrooms. Now I'm using a really old Tim Holtz distress tool that I've had for years, and I'm distressing the edge of that torn piece of pattern paper. I also add a little bit of the Staz On ink to the edge. Usually I use distress oxides for inking, but I figured since I had the Staz On ink right there and I knew that this ink would, of course, match the stamping I did on the background, I decided to use the Staz On. I attached the strip of paper down to the background, and now I'm further distressing the edge of the paper by bending it and ruffling up a little bit. And then I decided to add a little bit of modeling paste to the pattern paper. I used this tiny palette knife and the same modeling paste that I used on the background. And now I'm dragging that palette knife across the pattern paper, and I don't really have a plan in mind. I just knew I wanted to add a little bit of variation to the pattern paper. It already has a lot of variation, but I thought that this would add a nice little touch. I also wanted to add some stamping to the pattern paper, so you could see here that I'm using that Staz On ink again, along with the same stamps that I used on the background. I don't usually stamp on pattern paper when I layer it on top of a mixed media background, but I thought that this could help the pattern paper and the background kind of come together a little bit more, so I gave it a try. Now I want to add another strip of pattern paper on the right-hand side of the layout. I wanted this strip to be a little bit thinner, so I ripped it and then I ripped it again. I wanted it to be a little bit irregular along the edge. And once again, I used my Tim Holtz distressing tool to distress those edges and have them look just a little bit more grungy to match the ripped paper on the other side of the layout. I didn't really plan on adding this second strip of paper on the right, but it just seemed to make sense once I added the mixed media to the background to have another strip of paper to go along with the second area of color that I have on the right. And once again, I use the Staz On to ink the edge, and then I use some ATG adhesive and attach the strip of paper down to the layout. Once again, highly distressing that edge so that it will look like it goes with the edge on the other side. And then you could see here that once again, I am using the modeling paste and my palette knife and adding some areas of modeling paste to the pattern paper. I'm glad I tried out adding the modeling paste to the pattern paper. I think that that's kind of cool, and I'll have to try that again in the future. I didn't add a ton of it, just a little bit, and I think that that little bit just made the pattern paper look a little bit more interesting. I guess it wouldn't work on every pattern paper, but I think that it kind of worked for this particular pattern paper. And then again, I'm using the modeling paste on the background, using the palette knife to spread it around. At this point in the layout, I was kind of just having fun and I wasn't really sure what photograph I wanted to use. And I usually don't work that way. I usually will tailor the colors and the composition of the layout around the photo that I choose. Not always, but usually, because usually the thing I'm most inspired by is my photo. In this case, I really love the kit so much, and I knew that I wanted to use yellow with this pattern paper. So then I looked through an envelope of photos that I keep handy, and I found this photo of both of my daughters at Easter. I had printed it out for another layout and didn't end up using it. So I thought this was a great photo to use for this layout. It's just the right size. I mounted it on some white cardstock, and then I used a small piece of heavy white cardstock as a second mat. I inked the edges with some Distress Oxide in Picked Raspberry. Then I attached the photo down to that second pink mat, and now I'm using some fun foam to pop it up off the background and just give it a little bit of dimension. I chose pink because I thought that was the most eye-catching color of the collection, and so I thought that it would help my photo to stand out. And then I removed a little bit of the foam because I thought that the photo was going to sit on top of the ruffled edge of the pattern paper. I ended up moving it over a little bit anyway, but it didn't matter because there was enough foam to give it some dimension. Finally, I'm ready to add some embellishments to the layout. I have these large fussy cut flower clusters. And then in addition to the larger clusters, I also tucked in some smaller fussy cut pieces. Some were cut from the cut apart sheet and some of them were cut from the pattern papers. But I wanted there to be a little bit of a flow of the florals underneath the photo. And then I did the same thing in the cluster on the upper right-hand side. I have the large cluster, and then I tucked in some more greenery and also some feathers. The feathers were from the cut-apart sheet. And I really enjoyed working with these large-scale images, and I liked the way there were some smaller images to tuck around them. And I also really liked the color scheme. I liked the idea of having the blue and then the almost hot pink mixed in with the blue and then the neutrals as well. Because I popped up the photo on some foam, I had to pop up this cluster so that it would sit well on the page. So I just popped up that flower cluster. I didn't pop up the one in the upper right-hand corner. And then I began attaching all of the elements down to the page. In the end, the cluster on the bottom looks a little bit less fanned out and a little bit more compact. You'll see that in the final photo. Somewhere along the way, I rearranged and pushed together some of those embellishments. Something that I really liked adding to this page was fussy cut butterflies. I decided to use 3 blue butterflies for this layout. So I have one in the 2 main clusters, and then I put another one up on top of the photo. To give the butterflies some dimension, I did one of my favorite things, which is to add some fun foam to their wings, and then add adhesive on the fun foam and on the center of the butterfly, and then press down on the center of the butterfly and pop up their wings. I say that on a lot of my videos because I use butterflies on a lot of my layouts, and I really like it when they have some dimension. Once I had all 3 butterflies popped up on some foam and attached down to the background of the layout, I decided that I was going to add one of the Shimmerz dots to the left-hand side of the photo. I just thought that was the perfect spot for that embellishment. I also wanted to add some photo corners, and I used this same piece from the cut apart sheet to add photo corners in my last layout. I just like the way the scale of this pattern is very tiny while some of the other images on the page are a little bit larger, and I thought that the color of these photo corners was very noticeable. Then at the 11th hour, I decided I really should ink the edges of all of these pieces on the layout. So I go back and I pick up each of these elements that I have on the page, and I added some distress ink in Vintage Photo. This is definitely not the most convenient time to decide to do this, but it all worked out in the end. I looked through my stash of titles and I found this chipboard piece that says Sweet. I thought that was a great title, and I also thought it was a nice size for this layout. So I embossed it with some Ranger glitter embossing powder called Raspberry Tinsel. And I added that below the large cluster on the bottom. I used some gel glue to attach that in place. Now I'm adding some die cuts to my layout. If you've been with me for a while, you may know that I love adding these types of florals. I like adding some white back into some very colorful clusters. I also like the fact that these little branches are very small in scale, and I thought that would be a nice contrast to the larger items that I have on the layout right now. So I used some gel glue and I attached those down in quite a few places in those 2 large clusters. Now I'm adding some sequins to my layout. I've been on a sequins kick lately, and I really like these particular sequins because they are almost clear, but they have a little bit of a shimmer to them, a little cast of pink and yellow, and I thought that that went well with the layout. So I used this tool that I can pick up the sequins with, and I used some glossy accents to attach those sequins down to the page. I think it's a great adhesive for doing that. And although I didn't expect to add any black to the layout, I did see there was a little touch of black in those photo corners, so I added some black dots to each of those 2 photo corners, and this layout is complete, and here are some close-ups. To receive a free gift with your next order of Shimmerz paints, please put my name in the comments. You can check out this beautiful kit and also the October kit on the Shimmerz website. The link is in the description box. Thank you so much for watching this video. I greatly appreciate you taking time out of your day to watch it. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.